Welcome back. You're watching Business Morning on Channels Television. Now, capital market solicitors in Nigeria are calling for a legal framework for the array of structured products in the country. Now, at a structured product summit on Tuesday, Channels Business News correspondent Temple Ashajo had a chat with the chairperson of the Capital Market Solicitors Association, Ms. Yinka Edu, who speaks to the challenges and prospects of the derivatives market.
Talk us through the motivation for the choice of this topic this time.
It's an interesting one. You know, that's the thing about financial markets generally. There's a lot of overlap. Even when we talk about lending, if we're talking about it in the sort of money markets, we'll talk about lending. In the capital markets, we'll talk about bonds. So there's always that overlap. There's always that, there's always that, and I wouldn't say tension, but there's always that overlap. Now, in relation to derivatives, it's the same thing. So you can have your bilateral derivatives transactions, which mostly entered into currently anyway by the banks and corporates. And those ones currently, because of the banks, the CBN has some regulation in relation to that. Somebody mentioned today prudential guidelines. So we have general prudential guidelines which say if you're lending, then a certain amount of capital that you need to have as a bank to make sure that the banks remain safe. Prudential guidelines around derivatives are yet to be put in place. So this is something that I'm hoping, even though I think people are not seeing it as the number one issue, and perhaps it isn't. A lot of talk has been about closeout netting, which seems to be the number one issue, but it's also probably the easiest to achieve. But we're hoping that some of the other issues also, for example, as I've said about capital adequacy around derivatives and so on, will also come out of this.
The Nigerian Stock Exchange currently has ETFs that track equities in the market. What do you make of those products, and what else can they do to improve on it and make it more attractive to investors?
I think that there is so as I said, generally currently now, the derivatives transactions that are taking place, what I'm advising on are bilateral derivatives contracts between banks, mainly between foreign banks and local banks. We had Credit Suisse here, for example. I know Goldman Sachs are also here and are busy in these types of transactions. That jump between how a very structured derivatives transaction works, there's a lot of talk about the fact that you can structure around any risk, and then making it into a securitized form that is of interest to the markets generally. I think that's the jump, that's the difference that we need to understand better as a market. And that's what I'm hoping that the Stock Exchange and FMDQ, both of whom are promoting this, are going to be able to help us to understand better. So I think many of us in the room understand the derivatives, bilateral contracts, but many of us don't understand how that's going to move to the securitized form, the standardized form, how having a standardized instrument is actually going to protect our risks.
So you are also a lawyer, and we're talking about regulations. We know the CBN has got an act in place since 2011 or 2013 that looks into the derivatives market, especially commercial papers. But as it were right now, we know that the Securities and Exchange Commission is the entity that regulates securities instruments in the capital market space. Talk to us about who should really regulate this market, the CBN or the SEC?
The regulators are looking at different things. So even though we've talked about CBN and SEC, I will also bring PENCOM and NICOM into this, because I believe they also need to put into place regulations. They will be regulating, obviously, their own constituency. So PENCOM will be regulating the pension funds. But if pension funds are going to invest in these types of instruments, then PENCOM has to put in place what type of the types of regulations that will apply. In what circumstances can they do so? How much can they hold? What type of derivatives can they hold? Are they going to, I have no doubt, they're going to start with plain, relatively vanilla, maybe FX swaps, or, that sort of thing. And then maybe that market will develop. It's the same with the insurance community. I think SEC has to regulate the listed derivatives, and so I think that will automatically happen there. But certainly because of the banks, because if you look at the crisis that people have sort of alluded to, the major impact was on the banks. So I think the CBN is certainly going to have to regulate the banks, because any impact on the bank is an impact on the whole market.
Settlement is also very, very important when talking about securities in the capital markets. Tell us about the relevance of settlement in this discussion.
We have, certainly, I think settlement is very important for exchange-traded derivatives because of the risk of counterparties. You know, there's been some talk about collateral, there's been some talk about margining, and those are to manage the risk between counterparties. Because exchange-traded derivatives are going to be exchange-traded, and therefore you haven't got that same link, KYC, etc., that you would have between parties who are engaging bilaterally. The way that it works in other jurisdictions, the way it will work in Nigeria also is that there will be a central counterparty, which will be an institution. So if I buy from the central counterparty. If I sell to the central counterparty. That central party, will not fail, or at least that's the general idea, will be able to be the counterparty for those transactions. So CSCS and the CCP, the central counterparty, are absolutely vital. We have somebody from the CSCS that's speaking on a panel shortly. And I believe that a CCP has just been established by the Nigerian Stock Exchange. If you remember, Mr. Aibuji Aijimokwede also mentioned the fact that it doesn't make sense to have a central counterparty for the NSE and a separate central counterparty for the FMDQ. So the hope is that party will act as a CCP for the market. But certainly you're absolutely right that settlement and counterparty risk is absolutely vital in relation to this.
So while calls heighten on the need for a clearer oversight arrangement for the market, regulators from the Securities and Exchange Commission as well as the National Pension Commission explain what must be done to improve capacity for derivatives development in Nigeria.
If you look at what we are currently doing in the area of CCP, there is already a registration process ongoing for CCP, and there are plans to have equity-linked options and futures in the market. So currently, the Commission is undergoing, trying to look at best practices around the world and look at other jurisdictions, and also liaise with our partners in different parts of the world and IOSCO to see how we can have a very robust rules and guidelines on CCP. So currently, we are working on CCP, and we know that CCP is very vital when it comes to derivative. Of course, the counterparty risk is a major issue with derivatives. If you look at the things we are considering, we are looking at maybe there should be preference for exchange-traded derivatives as against OTCs. Of course, we understand that following FMDQ and NASD, a lot of activities that were done OTC before now, they are now done on a kind of platform that we can also say they are exchanges, although we call them OTC exchanges. So there are preference for exchange-traded derivatives by the time they are coming up. And we're also looking at issues around what type of investors should go into this type of investment. Should they be institutional investors, or can we allow retail investors? So due consideration are given to all this, and we're saying, okay, maybe at the first instance we can consider institutional investors who are more informed about some of these things before we start seeing how to expose them to retail investors. But I think one thing that is important is that the regulator is also not saying, let me make rules, because you know derivative can come in several derivations, and you can't possibly say, let me make rules in all aspects of this. But by the time the market is growing, and that's part of what we're doing here, by the time everybody has good knowledge and good grasp of this, and the market comes up with the kind of product that it thinks is very good, we say that the knowledge is very good, we also try as much as